Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to Late Night Learning. I am your host, Dr. Anthony Palomba. Now, today we are going to be continuing our discussion on breaking down academic research. As a review from last time, we were talking a little bit about introductions, lit reviews, and theories. And then we kind of wrapped up on operationalizing a variable, which, as we know, means defining what the variable is. We can't very well study brand loyalty without saying, what do we mean by brand loyalty? We can't very well study brand satisfaction or brand awareness or intent to purchase without defining these variables. Otherwise, our study is going to become convoluted, which is the last thing we want when we're doing research. So let's get moving. So in this slide, theory and approaches, I alluded earlier to what a theory is and to what an approach is. And I just wanted to bring some clarity here. Now, a theory helps highlight how or why something happens. You can see here in the study that I've assigned to you that I was able to publish, I tested the expectancy value theory and the uses and gratifications approach. Now, you can see here on the slide, I've also recognized what an approach is. Now, a theory does help highlight how or why something happens. An approach possesses less rigor than a theory, as it often does not take as much risk as a theory does. For instance, the uses and gratifications approach really doesn't take much risk as self-determination theory, since people use media for anticipated gratifications. Let me back up there. And so, what I'm trying to explain here is that uses and gratifications is an approach because, yeah, people typically use media for anticipated gratifications. When is that not true? If a theory is constantly supported, well, it's not really a theory. There's no risk being taken there. For self-determination theory, on the other hand, we state that to enjoy and pursue and maintain psychological well-being, consumers need to engage in activities in which they are competent, autonomous, and related. And so they must feel competent in the media selection that they've gone into. They must feel autonomous in that decision. Nobody else told me to play Super Mario Brothers. And 3, there must be some sort of relatedness here. I'd like to share this media consumption experience with other people. That may or may not be supported in video game studies, and if you look at the literature, it has a history of being unsupported and supported. It takes greater risk there in trying to explain how we reach and maintain psychological well-being. And so, as you can see below at the bottom there, achieving and maintaining psychological well-being may not manifest in each media consumption process. Let's move along here. And so, linking variables together. Now, what you can do here is if you go through the literature review that I've assigned to you, you can see here that I've linked variables together here. In linking variables here, when you're writing a literature review, there are several things that you should be thinking about. For one, you want to make sure your topic sentences refer to the previous variable. This is important when you're trying to have a smooth discussion in your literature review. That's important to do here. You should make a brief reference to the variable previously. This will help your writing become more fluid and well articulated. And so, additionally, you want to make sure that the final sentence in your variable discussion references the next variable. Editors will look for this. And so I strongly recommend writing about the dependent variable first here. Why? If you think about it, if your dependent variable is something along the lines of brand loyalty, it helps to write about brand loyalty first, because brand loyalty is a dependent variable in a study that may surround why people purchase Honda cars. If you introduce the dependent variable first, then you can introduce the independent variables and then link the independent variables back to the dependent variable. And since you've already brought up the dependent variable, it is way easier to talk about it in the literature review. So for each independent variable, there are two things you should be mindful of. For one, the first paragraph should explain the variable and operationalize it at that. It should also discuss findings in other studies surrounding the variable and how this may be related to the present study. Additionally, the second paragraph should serve as a link between an independent variable and a dependent variable. It should be written to justify and lead up to the research question or hypothesis that is being tested. And so, if you look at the study here, and if you look on page 37, I have a list of hypotheses here. Let's look at the first hypothesis. Now, let me also clarify here, the way that this journal article is articulated is not in the traditional sense. And so it's a little bit wonky compared to what I've been discussing with you thus far. But this is how the journal editor wanted the article to be laid out for publication. If we look at the first hypothesis here, we can see that the H1 is the relationship that I am testing here. High brand loyalty video game players who perceive that they have high emotional intelligence will be more likely to actively seek gratifications. If we go to H2, it's another relationship that's being tested here. High brand loyalty video game players who have high perceived emotional intelligence will have strong media consumption experiences. Okay, let's focus on H2 here, the second hypothesis, on page 37. And so we can see here high brand loyalty video game players, fine. Video game players that have high brand loyalty, who have high perceived emotional intelligence, will have strong media consumption experiences. Perceived emotional intelligence will have strong media consumption experiences. Perceived emotional intelligence would be the independent variable because that will impact having strong media consumption experiences, right? So if you look at perceived emotional intelligence here, you can see that this is discussed in how it might impact media consumption experiences here. And so what you're looking to do, especially in the literature review, is trying to make a connection between two different variables here. And so you can see here with perceived emotional intelligence, if you go back to 2.3, what I will be asking you to do is to read the entire section here. Go back to 2.3, take a moment and read 2.3, and then I'd like you to read 2.4 afterwards. That's media consumption experiences. Take a moment, pause the video. Great. So now that you're back, you can see what I'm trying to measure here. And so what I'm looking at, and you can see this written about in the last paragraph under perceived emotional intelligence, is looking at how consumers use their own active awareness of their emotions to impact their consumption experiences. I am feeling happy. I know that I'm happy. I can see it. I'm actively aware. I am actively thinking about my happiness. I believe that I have this capability to be aware of my own emotions. That's what perceived emotional intelligence states. And so that might impact my own media consumption experience, which is in 2.4. Okay. A natural extension of active emotions management is awareness of the actual media consumption experience, which has not been extensively studied by media scholars. You can see this first topic sentence under 2.4, where media consumption experiences is laid out. And so you can see in the second paragraph, I operationalize what media consumption experiences are. You can see it in the first sentence here. Media consumption experiences refers to how consumers feel sensations and feelings during actual media consumption in their daily lives. I have operationalized and defined the variable there. That is incredibly clear. Additionally, and not that I mean to jump around, you can see it with perceived emotional intelligence at 2.3 at the top of the second paragraph at the bottom. Perceived emotional intelligence takes into consideration active emotions management. It is defined as the ability to monitor one's own and others' feelings and emotions, to discriminate among them, and to use this information to guide one's thinking and actions. And so as you can see here, consumers may use their own active emotional intelligence to guide their activities. And so you can see how I've linked these two variables together. And so it's important to be mindful of how I might link these two together so that I can later test them. And you can see that I discuss the relationship between these two as we go through the end of perceived emotional intelligence. In the last paragraph, you can see that I discuss the relationship between perceived emotional intelligence and during video gameplay, how consumers may feel. This is tackled at the last sentence of perceived emotional intelligence. This also aids scholars in further understanding not only what consumers seek from video gameplay, but what they experience during video gameplay and how this might impact their video gameplay expectations and reflections afterwards. Okay. And so, again, to be mindful here, I know that this study is organized a little bit differently, but when you are writing a lit review, typically, for each independent variable, the first paragraph should discuss the variable, the second paragraph should discuss that independent variable's relationship to the dependent variable. Keep that in mind for when you have to write your own literature review. Let's keep moving. And so here we can kind of see research questions and hypotheses are incredibly important to go through and to present here. A research question is meant to be exploratory in nature. What don't we know about? That's kind of something you want to have at the back of your mind when we're thinking about this. What don't we know about? Or do we know a little bit about something that really isn't much to go by? Differently, a hypothesis is a deliberate and refined statement about a relationship with much research to examine. And so, for instance, one hypothesis may be Nintendo video game console brand personality perceptions will have a positive impact on Nintendo brand loyalty. If we believe Nintendo to be juvenile, or if we believe it to be really, really whimsical, or if it has these strong brand personality traits, then we can say, oh yeah, if people really strongly believe this, and it's supposed to be indicative of how we perceive Nintendo to be, then it will likely lead to stronger brand loyalty. Because after all, Nintendo is kind of juvenile, whimsical, childish, fun, goofy, when we think about perceptions of the brand itself. And so that hypothesis makes sense there. When you're trying to articulate a hypothesis, you want to think about the relationship between the independent variable and the dependent variable. And so your independent variable, or I can do it from this angle as well, your independent variable could very well be impact of gender or income on brand loyalty toward a particular car brand or coffee brand, like we were talking about earlier. And so, for instance, let's say that we have this particular dependent variable. And so this dependent variable may be brand loyalty toward NBC, or brand loyalty toward Netflix, loyalty toward Netflix. Fine. What you may say here then is what independent variables impact brand loyalty. You might say income impacts brand loyalty. So your income is an independent variable, right? It impacts brand loyalty toward Netflix, which is your dependent variable. Income, the higher the income, could it be the higher the brand loyalty toward Netflix? Maybe, I don't know, but that would be a relationship to potentially test for. Could it be genre interest? as something that might impact Netflix? Yeah, because we know that Netflix is really specializing in stand-up comedy, documentaries, and even some horror content as well. And so the genre familiarity or the genre interest of a consumer may impact brand loyalty toward Netflix. Additionally, we may think of other things that might be relevant here. We might also think of movie interest or inclination to view movies or movie frequency consumption. Maybe people who frequently consume movies may have higher brand loyalty to Netflix. Why? Because Netflix provides so many movies, many of which are new, some of which are old. And so that might mean that the more frequently we view movies on Netflix, the more inclined we are to have strong brand loyalty toward Netflix. So as our movie frequency goes up on Netflix, we're watching movies on Netflix, our brand loyalty toward Netflix rises as well. So this is a direct or positive relationship. The independent variable goes up or increases. The dependent variable goes up or increases. Okay. And so these are ways in which to start thinking about hypotheses and the ways to kind of organize them. Of course, if you need any more clarification, please contact me, but this is a really neat way to think about how to articulate and manage hypotheses and research questions. A research question may be, what are the motivations behind using social media and watching TV? Media multitasking, right? It's kind of what that's referencing. And so that's an example of a research question. It's exploratory in nature. What you're interested in learning is on something that really hasn't been explored or delved into much in the past. Differently, with a hypothesis, what we are interested in is getting a sense of relationships. Now, I just went over a direct relationship here. I have not gone over an inverse relationship or a negative relationship for that matter. And so it could very well be, if we go outside the realm of media and we think about sunlight and coats, it could very well be that if this is your dependent variable, it could be whether or not you wear a jacket or how many layers of clothing you wear. What might impact how many layers of clothing you wear? This is your dependent variable. We're going to make this the independent variables this time. What makes the amount of layers that you wear vary up and down? What makes them vary up and down? What you might see here are a few things. For one, it could very well be temperature. As the temperature, which is an independent variable, goes up and increases, the amount of clothes we wear goes down. That makes sense, right? If we think about the amount of layers we wear for clothing, and we think about temperature, temperature is our independent variable, the amount of clothes we wear is our dependent variable. As temperature goes up, the amount of clothes we wear decreases, inevitably, right? That's an inverse or indirect relationship. An inverse or indirect relationship. Now, you can also say that there are direct relationships that decline together as well, that may go down together as well. The less amount of time that I study, the lower my grade, right? So if grade and amount of time studied are looked at here, amount of time studied is my independent variable, grade on assignment is my dependent variable. The less and less I study, the lower and lower my grade, right? They both decrease together. This is also a direct relationship because they're both declining. If a relationship between an independent variable and a dependent variable decline together or incline or increase together, those are direct relationships. If they go in opposite directions, that is an indirect relationship or an inverse relationship. Again, if you need clarification, and I've stated this earlier, please feel free to rewatch the video or to email me. I'm happy to specify and clear up any questions here surrounding hypotheses, research questions, independent and dependent variables. Let's move along. Designing hypotheses. So a hypothesis is first and foremost a statement about a relationship, as I just went over earlier. Your goal should be to state whether or not there is a direct relationship or an indirect relationship. This is a bolder statement from a research question, as there's usually more literature to support a hypothesis here. Let's move along. So these are several examples of hypotheses, what they sound like, what they kind of test. And so if you look at the bottommost hypothesis, this is the easiest one to kind of get through. Perceived relative advantage of mobile news will be positively related to the adoption of mobile news. That's easy. Positively related. So if we keep adopting mobile news, if we're inclined to see an advantage in adopting mobile news, that will actually increase our rate of adoption of mobile news. So another kind of hypothesis here is the middle bullet here, the second one. High brand loyalty video game players who perceive that they have high emotional intelligence will be more likely to actively seek gratifications here. And finally, the topmost, which is a little bit more complex, aggregate 7th generation video game console brand personality perceptions will have a high or positive impact on aggregate 7th generation video game console brand loyalty. And so what you can see here is that relationships are constantly tested here. And so if you look at the second bullet, again, as an example, high brand loyalty video game players, players with high brand loyalty, video game players with high brand loyalty, who perceive that they have high emotional intelligence, will be more likely to actively seek gratifications. And so if they have high perceived emotional intelligence, they're aware of their emotions, they'd like to do something about their emotions actively, it's likely they're going to seek out gratifications. That's testing for a relationship here. That's what I'm getting at when we consider how we structure a hypothesis here. Let's move along. Mediation. Mediation. Mediation is when we consider a third variable as a necessary step. It's usually a missing link between two variables. Now, I alluded to earlier looking at study effort and grade earned on a test. Many of you should know that study effort is obviously an independent variable, and grade earned on a test is a dependent variable. That should be clear. The amount of effort we invest in studying should impact the grade that we earn on a test. However, there's one thing we're not thinking of here: the method of study. That's an important step or an important missing link that is useful here, because you probably have studied hard before and not done well on a test. Well, what was your method of study? This is something that sometimes we don't consider. So method of study here can be a mediator. It can directly affect the relationship between study effort and grade earned on test. This is an example of a hypothesis that may be written here. The relationship between study effort and grade earned on an exam will be mediated by method of study. And without getting too much into what that means, a statistical test must be run here to kind of test that out. Let's go to the next slide. Sometimes you will have a moderator in which it is a variable that may indirectly impact the relationship between two variables. And so here you may have an instance in which, again, the study effort depicted here is your independent variable. The grade on the exam is the dependent variable. Fine. The moderator indirectly impacts this relationship. Let me explain. You are studying hardcore for a chemistry exam or a bio exam or a marketing exam. Hopefully that'll give you a better grade on the exam. You do not, during the next few days up until your exam, have to sleep. It's recommended, it's healthy, it's very likely that you'll sleep, but you do not have to sleep. You could stay up for the next few days. You could. And so sleep may have an indirect, though necessary, contribution and impact on the relationship between study effort and grade on the exam. And so it could very well be that the relationship between study effort and grade on the exam will be moderated by the number of hours of sleep by the participant or from the participant. And so this is a way in which to articulate a hypothesis that acknowledges some sort of moderating variable. For mediating variables, for moderating variables, it's up to you to call them out. There's no rule on whether or not you include them. There's really no rule about anything in academia. It's all about making justifications and arguments for studying what you're studying here. Let's move on. So in designing research questions, if you elect to write a research question in your lit review, there should be a paucity of available literature on the focus of your research. It's your judgment call. It's up to you to ask a research question if you just can't find a lot of information on something. You know, I just can't find a lot of research on virtual reality and television programming. Can't. Looks like it's going to have to be a research question here because I really don't have a lot of information to go on to properly test a relationship. Instead, I'll ask a question and try to see how it goes in my investigation. You need to be able to phrase this as a question as well. It is important to consider using how and does at the beginning of your question. This will aid you in asking a really rich question that begs more from the study than a simple yes or no. Let's move along. You can see here a few examples of research questions. What motivations do consumers have for watching video content? For the second research question, what specific motivations for watching video content affect consumers' perceived substitutability between online video platforms and television? For the third research question, do users and non-users of online video platforms differ in how they perceive the substitutability between online video platforms and television? If so, how? You can see with each research question, I'm asking something open. I'm also asking something that does not lend itself to a yes or no response. I'm asking for more. Now, at the bottom here, it's important to note, for every does or do question, it's really good to place an if so how at the end of the question. It does bring clarity and depth to your question. You are looking for more than whether or not there's a substantial occurrence. We're not interested in solely if something exists or doesn't exist. We want to know how and why it exists and maintains and sustains itself. And so I recognize that this was a very, very long lecture, a very heady one at that. I do recommend rewatching it just to get a better sense of what I'm going over here. Remember, when you're writing your literature review, you should explain theory first. You should then explain the dependent variable, and then you should explain your independent variables. For each independent variable, you should simply explain what the independent variable is in the first paragraph, and then in the second paragraph, you want to be able to link the independent variable with the dependent variable, and then have a hypothesis or research question that examines the relationship you're putting forth. I recognize that this is a lot, and it's a little wonky, and it's a little bit weird, but this will give you confidence in structuring your own research studies, and it will help you along in conceptualizing your own studies and making studies up. For all the information and knowledge we have as researchers, there's a lot of creativity here, and that's why I say making things up. It isn't that we're very loose in the methods and kinds of ways that we employ research, but it does take a fair bit of creativity. And on its face and on its surface, when you first think of a study, you are making something up. You're basing something on what you've seen or heard or have an interest in. And then you go out and you try to make an argument for studying it, and then it may become more concrete over time as you approach data collection and analysis. But all researchers have to be creative here. And you are, to an extent, making something up before you write the lit review and create a justification and solid ground for why you're studying what you're studying. Well, that's all the time we have on Late Night Learning. As always, keep laughing and keep learning.